Hi everyone. Today I am talking to Tom Weirich. Tom is the head of marketing and stakeholder relations for EDP Renewables North America. In 2022, he published a book called We Took the Risk. It details the stories of early leaders in the renewable energy industry. It's a great resource for anyone looking to get involved in the industry, or if you already work in renewables, it's a great way to get re-inspired, re-energized, and to learn more about the industry. So in this conversation, Tom talks about his time working for the American Council on Renewable Energy, also known as ACORE, as well as some lessons he learned from his mentor, Bill Holmberg. And he also talks about what it was like to write this book and his experience working with the Creator Institute at Georgetown University. So yeah, that's pretty much it, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. Hi, Tom. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I'd love to start out by asking a little bit about what was your experience like growing up and how did you first start working in renewables?
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Sophie. It's great to be on here, and thanks again for thinking of me and having me join you all. Oh gosh, so going back, I grew up in an immigrant family. So my parents were refugees who fled from communist Czechoslovakia in the '60s, and they came to New York and started their life in New York. And so I'm a born and bred New Yorker, born in Manhattan, grew up in Queens, and then moved upstate when my dad's manufacturing facility moved up there and stayed in New York until I was 18. Then went down to DC to go to Georgetown for undergrad college, and I would say that's kind of where my story began. Right, going to Washington with high dreams, high hopes, to try to make an impact in our nation's capital, and it was when I was there in Georgetown in Washington that I got to learn more about renewables. Right, before I then headed off to grad school in Chicago and then to initial careers in Silicon Valley that brought me back to DC, right? So in Washington, when I came back, is when I really got my full taste of renewable energy through a friend of mine, Jody Roussel, who was helping set up and found the American Council on Renewable Energy, ACORE.
Awesome. So yeah, kind of speaking to that moment that you talked about, kind of returning to DC and first learning about ACORE, the American Council on Renewable Energy. You have a great passage in the book about that, and I'd actually love for you to read that if you'd be willing.
Oh, 100%, 100%. So I have the book in front of me, the hard copy book. Um, as a young 23-year-old who had just been laid off from a Silicon Valley job due to corporate restructuring, I had arrived back in Washington, D.C., naive but eager to be back. Having graduated a few years earlier from Georgetown University, returning to D.C. was coming back home. The streets were all the same, with familiar bars like Rhinos in Georgetown and Brass Monkey in Adams Morgan, packed with Hill staffers debating politics. After undergraduate studies in Georgetown University, followed by graduate studies in international development at the University of Chicago, I'd originally thought I would be a diplomat. However, after taking the Foreign Service test 4 times to no avail, I realized I was approaching my future career in the wrong way. I was looking at a career end goal, but was not dedicating time to creating a game plan for how to get there. While at the University of Chicago, and at the urging of a mentor, I honed in on my skill sets and what I enjoy doing. From telling a story in front of a captive audience to marketing student volunteer efforts and events, I discovered my strongest skill set through communicating a story. At that point, I realized marketing was my passion, and I looked forward to applying that skill set to an industry that was making a positive impact in the world. Settling back into DC included avoiding getting pebbles in my sneakers on daily morning runs in the mall, as well as remembering that the metro always seemed to have limited service. Being back reminded me how truly small DC was. This was proven by consistently bumping into someone I knew, literally on every block, on my way downtown to work. Welcome to ACORE were the first words I heard that late November morning when I walked into a townhouse located south of DuPont Circle. Having left Silicon Valley a little deflated and feeling like a failure, those words, delivered with such sincerity and hope, defined a moment I'll never forget. I would associate those first words with my entry into renewables. The delivery of that welcome was none other than Jody Roussel, a former classmate and friend from Georgetown. And it's funny, the power of words. Every time I remember that memory, I associated it randomly with the smell of a fresh garland, like a fresh Christmas wreath, because Jody who is originally from Vermont, um, always put up fresh garlands and wreaths that she would have FedExed from her family in Vermont in the ACORE office. And I remember that moment when I opened the door and she said, "Welcome to ACORE," which was for me, welcome to renewables, right? I always associate it with smelling a garland fir and a Christmas wreath, right? And it's amazing how every time I think of that memory, I can smell fresh fir from Vermont, right? So, yeah. But that was my welcome, and that was my welcome to renewables, which for me means a lot.
That's great that the smell of kind of like the fresh, if it was like pine needles or whatever it was, like coming from the.
It was fresh pine from Vermont, right? That has been stitched together with wiring, right? And what I loved was every year for the first couple of years at ACORE, when Jody was there, that would be a delivery we would get, and we would actually take half the day. We'd shut down the office to hang up the garland along the rafters, right, and put up the Christmas wreath. It's a memory I'll have for the rest of my life, and to have that time period associated with me coming into renewables and having that physical welcome to ACORE, welcome to renewables, right, was a life-changing moment for me now that I look back at it. Yeah.
So we've kind of been talking about ACORE, and I'd love for you to talk more about kind of what that organization does and kind of how it like evolved over the years and what your role within it was.
So ACORE was started, it was started around right after 9/11. And actually, the first meetings were before 9/11, which I think defined the altruistic direction the organization took as a 501(c)(3) versus a lobbying organization. And I think 9/11, after the fact, made the need for a pan renewables organization, right, for the renewables industry to convene even more of a necessity, right, in dialogue on how to make our country more secure with homegrown energy, specifically renewable energy. And so it was pulled together by Mike Eckhart, who has now retired, right? But he was the president de facto and the CEO for a number of years when I was there. And Jody Roussel, who had went to school with me, was his researcher. So it was basically two people who had a dream, who had an idea, and tons of volunteers. It just shows you how volunteers are so important in the initial days of a nonprofit, right? It was volunteers, students, leaders like Roger Ballantyne from the Clinton White House back then, right? To folks from foundations, to folks in the industry like Matt O'Brien, right, and others from different solar companies who are like, we need this organization, let's volunteer our time. So it came together to be a pan renewables organization with the motto of we're pro renewables and against nothing, which also was really important. And I would say, given where we are with legislative conversations in Washington today, it's even more so important for us to be pro renewables and against nothing, because the mantra was, listen, the oil and traditional oil and gas industry had $0 to come after you as a renewables industry. But the minute you would go after them, they would have unlimited funds, right, to go after you. And that was something critical for us to remember, was that we needed to be pro something and not against something. That wasn't the message that would unite people. And even today, it's messaging that's positive, that's uniting, that actually does a better job, right, in the market than a message that's anti something, right? That really lacks, I would say, a spirit of cooperation and unity. So that was, I think, the uniting call for the industry. And so ACORE really did something that no other group had done to date, which was, let's pull together all the renewables groups, right, including the trade associations that existed. So back then, you had SEIA, you had AWEA, you had SEPA, you had GEA for geothermal energy, you had the Hydropower Association, right? You had all these groups, but they really weren't working together. They were all fighting for their piece of the pie. And the thinking behind ACORE was, let's gather everybody together. But more importantly, there were three facets or three sectors that need to be engaged to ensure not only the surviving of these early renewables technologies, but the flourishing of the industry. And that was the financial sector, the technology sector, and the policy sector, right, and the policy platform. And so what we tried to do was to really focus on those three stakeholder groups and engage them in conversation. So before ACORE, Wall Street really wasn't talking about renewables investments, right? And it was through ACORE and through its 501(c)(3) educational nonprofit approach that the banks then got involved and said, okay, we're now serious about looking into renewables financing. Let's engage others to get involved. The technology is obviously, and all the technology stakeholders were important back then because they were the technologies who were pitching, right, and selling. So further encouraging research and advancement from everybody from NREL and Sandia National Laboratories all the way up to the solar providers. Like First Solar had already started being strong in the market back then, as well as Sharp Solar and all these other solar companies that no longer exist, right? They were already advancing technology and trying to get us to that next iteration of technology to lower costs, right, and make it more scalable. They were important conversations, so we united those folks. And then lastly, the most important group were the policy stakeholders who had, until that point, not had a serious conversation on Capitol Hill about the importance of renewables and how policy can help grease the wheels and create certainty for the financiers and for the technology providers, right? So those are the three groups, or the three, the three mission points we had that we worked on when we created ACORE. And I think as a result of ACORE's creation and that pro-renewables message, right, of being against pro-renewables against something, plus uniting these three stakeholder groups, I think that's what the early industry needed. And that's the service I think ACORE provided and continues to provide to this date. I mean, when you look at which organization has most of the banks and investors in the U.S. That are involved in renewables as its membership, that's ACORE. So again, it was the combination of the message, the C3 educational status, right? Not lobbying, but educating. And then lastly, uniting these three groups that really made ACORE flourish.
That's awesome. I love how you talked about the fact that you were pro renewables and against nothing. I noticed throughout the book how you kind of have a positive message and you really focus on how like the different leaders, it seems like they really approach things with positivity, and then also like bringing people with different backgrounds and interests together was like how they were able to get a lot done.
Oh, 100%, 100%. And it really was back then, and it still remains an industry of maybe 1 degree of separation, or maybe two, very rarely two. And that's what's great about the renewables industry is even though it's growing and many new folks are coming to the table, you still have those folks who are the longest time have been fighting for renewables. They stay in the fight. And I think that's what makes this industry so rich from a historic perspective and from a passion perspective. And I think that's what attracted me in the early days to renewables. It was that energy, that passion of people having a story. Everyone in renewables has a story. I mean, it's really fascinating. I mean, best icebreaker at a renewables event is to ask people, how did you get into renewables? It will always work because everyone has an interesting story. No one had the same career path, right, into renewables. We all came from different places, from different disciplines, different focuses, but we all share the same passion. And I think that's what ACORE gave me when I joined ACORE. Mike gave me my first assignment, which I give as a first assignment to all my interns, which is, here's a list of 25 to 100 people that I want you to call. And you're not going to talk about business. I just want you to ask them about their renewable story and what they think about the renewables industry. And unbeknownst to me back then, I was like, oh gosh, that's a lot of phone calls to make. And this was the old days where you called. There were no teams, you called and then followed up with an email, right? But it was more the calling. Unbeknownst to me, Mike was handing me over my first Rolodex of contacts in renewable energy who would be with me and still are with me throughout my whole career, right? And and he told me, do that. But one piece of advice, he's like, don't leave the phone call without them introducing you to 3 more people. And that stuck with me today. And I do that for my interns. I'm like, hey, here's not 100 people. I'm like, hey, here's 10 or 15 people you should call, but ask them to give you 3 more recommendations of people they recommend you talk to. And, like I said, it's important for you, especially if you're early in your career, to get yourself out there and to create that Rolodex of contacts that today might not be useful from a business transaction perspective, but let me tell you, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years down the road, 15, 20, they'll be here in the industry and they'll be here to work with you and they'll know you. So it's important from your early days in your career to establish that network, that community that will be with you for the rest of your career.
That's awesome that was kind of part of your entryway into the industry and kind of getting to, sounds like it maybe like exposed you to people outside of just the ACORE team itself and the people who are working there and the volunteers there, and kind of expose you to like the industry in general.
Oh, 100%. And across all the technologies, right? That was just the biggest gift, and across all sectors. Yeah.
Was that like intimidating at all to be talking to those people on the phone?
Well, it's funny. So the way I paid for college, when I had a lot of jobs and scholarships to help fund college, and one of my jobs was I was one of those pesky telemarketers for alumni giving. that would call in the evenings to alumni asking them for money, right? So I did that for 2 to 3 years in college, 6 to 9 p.m. twice a week, and that got me over being nervous on the telephone. And also, it helped me, I would say, in my communication skills because I had to learn, unlike being long-winded today, I had to learn how to be succinct and get to the point, right? And also do a sales pitch. And I think um, that helped me get over any concerns I have calling somebody, but also it helps me in one-on-one communications, right? Even to today, I credit my I would say my ability to communicate efficiently, plus my ability to relax during interviews or during phone calls, due to those phone calls I used to make during college asking for money, right? And I believe sales, those sales skill sets aid all of us, no matter what part of the sector you're in, no matter what your job is, is to be able to pick up the phone and communicate effectively, right? Or get on conversation and be able to, in a span of a couple of minutes, connect with the person that you're talking to, right? And then get whatever you need out of the conversation. Yeah.
That's great, and it sounds like you were kind of able to take like a skill set you already had from something that wasn't as related to renewables and bring it into what you were doing at ACORE.
Oh, 100%. And, you know, back then, our industry did not have marketers or communicators. It was an industry of really smart scientists, right? Some early startup sales kinds of guys, but it didn't have marketers and communicators, right? And it was an industry starving for skill sets. And I still argue that we are an industry still starving for those skill sets, right? I think we're good now on the technology front. We're good on the development front, right? But never before in our history, I would say, storytelling and the ability to communicate effectively in market, never has it been more important than today. And I think what we're experiencing on Capitol Hill this week makes communications in the market even more so important, right? More than ever before, where we need to communicate the values of renewables, right? And also the benefits, right? The economic benefits, the community benefits, right? We no longer can give big job numbers, right, and big tax investment numbers to communities. We have to go into communities and get those stories, right, that show the success of renewables being implemented on the ground, right? That's going to be more than, and I would say even after this bill, we know where it's going, unfortunately, but I think even after things get signed, I think our new mission, especially in this first 2 years coming out of this, are those stories, right? And that's where my book, the reason I wrote my book was to give those people, those OGs in renewables, the opportunity to tell their story so that we wouldn't forget that, listen, this is almost like deja vu. We've been here before as an industry. We will get through it, but we need those stories. And we need those stories more so now than ever before.
Yeah, that's something that I think you highlight in the book is kind of how it's been an industry where like the policies have changed and there have been ups and downs, and the people who you profile were kind of able to keep their positive message and their like mission in view while all these different like changes were going on.
Agreed. And that's why, like, when I structured the book, right, I would say I was very deliberate in that I didn't just want to start with the stories. I wanted to provide a context by which you could place these stories in action, right? And that context was the political environment, right? So I kind of write about a quick crash course in policies and renewables, right, from the 70s forward, to show you kind of the disruptive nature and also the impact policies had, especially with the ITC, PTC constantly expiring and getting passed at the last minute, right? How that factored into the stories, right, and the decisions made and the risks taken by the storytellers, right, in the book, but also the economics, right, and what was going on with economy in the background, and also technology development, right. So I wanted to provide that context. I also was very deliberate about including traits, right. This whole book is not only about the stories, but the traits, right, that made these individuals successful in renewables, and traits that I feel are, some of them are inherent in people, right. Others are teachable. And so I wanted to kind of arm people coming into the industry with this ability to know the history of the industry, juxtapose that against traits that they should look into having, or if they can self-identify, great. That gives you even more reason to join the industry, and then have them empowered by those stories, right? So it's very deliberate to have those three, I would say, those three cornerstones, or those three sections of the books laid out that way, so that when people put down the book, they go, okay, I'm confident now. I can go into an interview as a first-time person coming into renewables and not feel intimidated, right? and feel like I have the background that I need to nail the interview, but also to get a head start in the industry, right? So that was my intent with the book, and I've been really fortunate to get a lot of feedback from people who walked into their interviews and aced it and said, hey, your book helped me. And I mean that. I know that comes off very self-serving to say that, but even if I helped one person with a book, I would have been happy. But I'm so happy when people come up and say, hey, you helped me out. And, we all try to pay it forward, right? We all had people who helped us get into renewables, and this was my way of paying it forward. So, happy that the book has helped people, just get into this industry, or if they've been in the industry a number of years, get re-inspired, right? And re-energized, and remember why we got into this crazy industry in the first place, right?
Yeah, I can totally see that. It was really informative, like for me, reading the information about the history of the industry and stuff, and seeing how, different people were kind of working together or like connected in different ways and stuff. So it was like great context and learning for me, and then also inspiring to see how people were able to push things forward, make progress, and especially like coming from the beginning of things being less established, and we're able to kind of like deal with that sort of uncertainty and like push forward and get things done. You've spoken before about how honoring your mentor, Lieutenant Colonel Bill Holmberg, was a motivating factor for writing the book. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about who Bill Holmberg was and the role he played in the renewable energy industry.
No, thanks so much for that. Oh gosh, Bill Holmberg. He was a giant of giants. So imagine a gentleman who's close to 6'4", 6'5", who's in his 80s, who just has a fire in his belly, right? To prove that biomass, including bioenergy, biofuels, are a vital part of our national security, right? That was Bill's big thing, and he was the godfather, for lack of a better way to describe him. And I think everyone in the industry will agree, he was the godfather of biomass and biofuels in the U.S.
I just wanted to make a quick note about what biofuels are in case any listeners don't know. So, according to Britannica, biofuels are any fuel that is derived from biomass, that is, plant or algae material or animal waste. Biofuel is commonly advocated as a cost-effective and environmentally benign alternative to petroleum and other fossil fuels, particularly within the context of rising petroleum prices and increased concern over the contributions made by fossil fuels to global warming.
He had a distinguished career, so as his title connotes, he was in the military. What I didn't know about him until the very end was that he was one of the top 80 most decorated Marines in U.S. history. And there's a lot of stories, and I don't want to do any. You have to read the chapter on him. The last chapter of the book, on purpose, I left him towards the end, and the chapter is entitled "Grit," which was his superpower, his trait. But he won multiple awards. He received, received and was recognized with multiple awards, including the Navy Cross and the Naval Star, and many other awards for his valor in saving human life, but in his passion and his determination and stubbornness to get things done. Hence the grit being his superpower. But anyway, I knew him through ACORE. So when I came to ACORE, he had merged his Biomass Coordinating Council, which was a voluntary group of biomass and biofuels companies, into ACORE. So it was a program of ACORE. And this guy, even in his 80s, would run 3 miles a day, come into the office by 7, 8 a.m. He'd be sitting there and be ready to take on the mission for the day, right? Of getting biomass and biofuels accepted in the industry, right? And working very closely with early companies like Poet, one of the ethanol companies, and many others, getting them all what they need from a policy, finance, technology perspective, get them flourishing, right? So that's how I knew Bill. And Bill challenged me to know its end, because he would come to me with this passion, with this visionary leadership, and say, hey, Weirich, I need this done. And it's important, right? And I was this 20-year-old going, well, I have so much to do right now. I don't know if I can take this on. He's like, and he would sit down and he would explain why, right? And as a 20-year-old, I don't think I valued, as I listened, but did I really digest everything? And it's funny how things come back to you later in life, and you value the time he spent explaining everything, right? And also entrusting you with the mission. And I think this is something that's just as important as storytelling communications in today's industry. it's sitting down with those entering our industry and entrusting them with the mission of, listen, we have a shared mission here to make sure renewable succeeds. Let's do it. And what is it going to take for us to do it, right? And enlightening that fire, right, in you. And so Bill and I worked together for a number of years at ACORE. And, what happened was I left ACORE and went to work at Cohen Resin Capital and was up in New York. And Bill succumbed to cancer and passed away. For some stupid reason, I couldn't make his funeral. And I felt guilty. I'm Catholic, so I have Catholic guilt. So I felt guilty, but also he deserved more as a mentor, right? And he just took his time to mentor me, right? And so what I thought I would do is, well, let me write an op-ed for Biofuels International, Biofuels Daily, one of the biofuels magazines, so that people don't forget his story and where he came from. And like I said, there's a lot of stories about what he got away with in my book that I don't want to, I don't want to spoil for folks who read the book. But for those that read the book, they'll agree there were a lot of chuckles in there. But I wanted those stories to be out there and for him not to be forgotten. So what's funny is I initially thought, okay, 800-word document, I could do it on a weekend, submit it, I'm done. And what I started to do was interview his former interns, which all are now CEOs of all the big biomass and biofuels companies, right? For stories. Tell me stories about Bill. And what ended up happening is each of them had their own story about how they got into renewables. And I was like, this is really interesting. I wish I knew all these OG stories, right? I wish I knew about these stories when I was starting out in the industry. And it's funny how things turn out. So I was doing these interviews. I was like, okay, this is interesting. This is going to be more than an article. There's a lot here. And at the same time, Professor Eric Kester from Georgetown called me. And this is, I don't believe in coincidences, right? Professor Kester called me from Georgetown and said, hey, I started up a new creator, this new institute called the Creator Institute at Georgetown. The goal is to, instead of students who want to be startup entrepreneurs, instead of them just going in and launching their startup, I'm encouraging them to write a book about it, to think through the process of a startup and what they want to sell and the whole goal and everything. And he's like, listen, I feel like for some reason today, I wanted to call you because I feel like you have a story to tell. You should write a book. And I swear at that moment, I could feel Bill Holmberg, from above saying, hey, you have a mission. You have to capture these stories. You have to write a book. And I couldn't say no, Bill. So I said, you know what? I'm going to do this. And lo and behold, here I am. I never thought I would write a book. I never thought I would author a book. And here I am. And I did that. So it's funny how life sometimes throws you the opportunity and you just have to say yes and take on the mission, take on the challenge and do it. So long story short, that's how, the book came about, how I knew Bill and how really Bill inspired me to create this book and go from there.
That's a really beautiful story, and I love how you kind of mentioned that you have reflected and felt like you kept getting more lessons or more learning from like the stuff he talked to you about earlier on, and it's really beautiful that you kind of felt that sense of like mission and purpose to like bring these stories together. So,
and that was his greatest gift. He left me with a mission, and what's amazing is the mission doesn't end. Right. And I think that was the reminder. And this book was a reminder for me in my, I've been 21 years now in renewables. And I think this book was a great way to energize me to say, especially during COVID, when people felt lost and, felt deflated and didn't have a sense of direction. This book actually saved me during COVID because I wrote this book during COVID. I did all the interviews, all my research during COVID. And it really gave me that mission. And it was a gift in a lot of ways.
That's awesome. And I think it's great for people reading the book to realize that they can have that sense of like inspiration and energy, especially young people who are reading it and wanting to like make a difference and realizing that they can learn from like these traits that people have embodied.
100%, 100%.
You mentioned that you worked with the Creator Institute at Georgetown University. I'd love to know, like, what was it like working with them?
So, like I said, Eric Kester started up this institute at Georgetown University in the McDonough School of Business. And his original intent was, like I mentioned, taking these MBA students who want to be startup entrepreneur types and have them, instead of having them write a business plan, the whole thing, write a book, think through the thesis, right? Think through the business plan and write a book. And in so doing, he wanted to reduce the ratio of startup failures right out of the gate. I think I forgot the stat, but what is it, like 8 in 10 startups when they first get out of the gate, they fail, right? So he wanted to reduce that ratio by having those startup leaders think through their game plan first and their business plan more thoroughly first before going into the market. So it evolved from that to really inspiring people to know that anyone can be an author, right? Now, interestingly enough, only, I think it's a very small stat in the single digits. Only, I want to say 3% of folks that start a book actually finish it and author a book, right? So it takes a lot of commitment. And the Creator Institute was there to not only give you a skill set, so it's set up almost like a program. So when I got involved, it's set up a program, 14-week program, where it's almost like an MBA, executive kind of MBA at night, where you spend twice a week in class. It was all virtual because it was during COVID, right? So in class, learning about not only the theory of writing, but also the business of writing. So royalties, your IPs, how to negotiate that. And also what it did was provide a community. So their big mantra, I think still is for the publishing company, is never write alone. And so what they also did was they had you in a cohort with other authors from other genres. I mean, I had somebody from a horror genre in my cohort. I had somebody doing a detective story. I had someone doing more a psychological evaluation kind of story book. It was all these combinations of folks. But what it did was you had other people who were going through the rigors of writing a book with you. And the Creator Institute, over those weeks taught you that all books are just stories. It's a compilation of stories. And it's onion layers of revisions that you do. So you automatically were assigned a development editor. You work with that development editor to pull together those stories and to pull together your thoughts on the structure of the book, right? And what the thesis would be and the goal of the book. And while you do those classes, you started pulling together your book. And then what happens at the end of the 14 weeks is you do what they call a big idea session with Professor Kester, where you basically present to him what's the big idea behind your book, right? And maybe present some initial, tidbits from the first chapter, any chapter in the book, right? And if he likes what you do, he then introduces you to Georgetown's publisher, New Degree Press, which is now called Manuscripts. And you meet with the publisher and you do your big publisher pitch, which includes initial table of contents, one chapter, and potentially up to 20,000 words. And then if the publisher likes it, they then say, okay, congratulations. And you graduate from working with your development editor then to working with your marketing and revisions editor. And you start, that's where the massive writing starts to happen. You take all the stories, right? You start to cobble them together. You figure out theme, thesis. What type of book is this? Is it a journey? Is it kind of a journey book? Is it a heroism kind of book with a hero at the end of it, right? You add on onion layers to the book. And really the book comes together not by you, okay, opening up your laptop saying, okay, chapter 1, boom, boom, chapter 2, boom, boom. You actually add onion layers of different themes, of different stories. And it's really through the art of revisions. And I think I did 31 revisions of this book. I mean, you get really invested in it. Every holiday, every weekend, right? It took I did this in an expedited way. It took me a year and a half. Usually books take a lot longer, but they made you stick to a deadline. And yeah, in a year and a half, the Creator Institute then has you basically publish the book. And luckily, the publisher also, what's really important as a first-time author is you have to decide how you want to go. I went with the publisher there, New Degree Press / Manuscripts, which was a community-based publisher, which means that you take on a lot of the financial risk, right? You do a fundraiser, to fundraise for to pay the development editor, right? And to pull together your funding for your editors. By doing that, you then own a lot of the royalties and your IP to your book, right? Now, if you go the other route, and let's say you go with a traditional publisher like Penguin or Random House, anybody like that, they'll take on the financial risk, right? They'll pay the editors, the development editors, whatever. They'll take on the financial risk, but then your royalty payments are nothing, and they own your IP. So it's almost like a Taylor Swift situation where she had to re-record Red, because she didn't have her own rights on. She couldn't go on tour because the songs were owned right by the record company. Same thing. If you go with a Penguin or Random House, there's a lot of restriction, and you can't go on book tour. You have to get approval from them, right? So that's why community publishers these days have become a bigger thing, and that's why I'd recommend highly, if you're a first-time author, go with a community publisher. There's many of them out there, but the Creator Institute obviously made it easier because they were tied to manuscripts, right? But it's really fascinating, the whole book writing industry and how that all works.
Yeah, that's really cool that you were able to go together like with a cohort and kind of interact with people who are also writing a book for the first time, but in a different genre.
Yeah.
So that was all over Zoom.
It was all over Zoom. We even had on the weekends or during the week, we had what we called library hours, where you would call into a Zoom session, but all of you are typing your book. You're all working on your book. And if you randomly came up with a question, or you just said, say, hey guys, have a random question or a quick thing. So it was really cool. So it did provide that community. And like I said, this was during COVID, so that made it even more so meaningful, right? To be able to socialize that way. But yeah, it was a community of writers. And I think, again, it reinforces the need for community. No matter what you do, community is so important, right? It's there to empower you. It's there for you to get a reality check when you need it, right? But also it's there to back you up on whatever endeavor you have, and that's why not only in the book writing sense was it important, but also just renewables in general, right? Having this community and knowing you can access the community, and every single person in this book is accessible. You shoot a LinkedIn message, say, hey, I'd love to talk to you. They're accessible, right? All by, Bill Holmberg, who unfortunately passed away. And that's the thing. A lot of these folks are getting older. So this is the time to reach out to them when you can. But the book, I think, also embodied that sense of how important community is.
Yeah, totally. I can really see how the book kind of shows the fact that people were like bringing different things to the table and figuring out how to work together and staying in touch while they worked, you know, over like long periods of time. And it's really cool that you were able to, I think with Zoom, it's kind of enabled some of these sort of like cohort based things to exist and for people to kind of get like put together with like what their like niche kind of thing that they're doing is. Like for
Mm-hmm.
this, it was like a first time author. And it's kind of enabled people to have those like resources and like community around that. So that's really cool. I'd love to know, you talked a little bit about like the classes that you did as part of the book writing process. So I'd love to know any like big takeaways you learned from those classes or anything you learned like through the process of writing the book.
Yeah, no, I listen. So a number of things. In regards to the classes, right? So I found the business of book writing really interesting, right? Like I mentioned, like the royalty payment negotiation, IP, how Amazon works, how printing works. Printing of books today is just fascinating. There are only two or three real printer of books left in this country that are not Amazon owned, right? So it's an Amazon prints by volume, right? And so it's just fascinating to learn where the book industry has gone. Also, when you want to get your book into bookstores, you actually individually have to call each bookstore and pitch them, and you have a tear sheet and you pitch them. Even Barnes and Noble, they're not centralized. You actually have to call the Barnes and Noble down the street and go, hey, and talk to the manager and say, listen, I have a book that just came out. This is why it's of importance. Here's the website to the book. I've already done pre-sales. This shows interest in the market, right? Hey, can you do a volume order, right? And I'll order 5 to 10 books, right? Stock it and then watch how the books sell. So it's the business of book writing was fascinating, and I think that's one of the biggest takeaways that I got from the classes from the Creator Institute. Another one was learning this art of book writing by revisions, right? I always thought, yeah, you open up a book and like a thesis, right? We in college or grad school, you do a report, you start on page 1 and you type out until you're done on page 20, right? Not so. You actually, when you write a book, you actually jump between chapters and creating sections, right? And there's a lot of thought that goes into that, as well as the number one thing that I did not at all think that I would appreciate was layout and my layout editor. Laying out a book, I thought, okay, it's like a yearbook, like, in high school, right? Not at all. So the layout of a book is so important. And layouts are different between paperback books and hardbound books, right? you have to go through a layout, and that's not only just the numbers of pages, but also where you divide up paragraphs, how you divide up thoughts, and that was just impressive, right? How you open up the book and where you have pictures and stuff. So between the business of book writing, right, and then something like layout, right, I learned a lot. I mean, the classes were just really eye-opening, and they're taught by experts who actually will walk you through the elements. They're also taught by authors who have already published a number of times. The one takeaway, though, that I want to really leave with people, anybody here who's inspired to write a book, please let me know. I'm happy to connect you with the Creator Institute. But the one thing I want to leave you with is do not self-publish. So a lot of people tend to want to go the easier, cheaper route and self-publish on Amazon, for example. Problem with self-publishing is this: if you do not hire a really good revision or layout editor, or your final typo editor, your final editor that reviews everything, a reviewing editor, if you don't hire the right people and if they don't do a good job, you might self-publish something that at first glance is just poorly written, poorly structured, has millions of typos, you name it. And if you then try to go to a publishing house and say, listen, I had a successful, let's say a self-published, it's a red flag for publishers, even community-based publishers. So think twice before you self-publish. I would encourage you, if you do have a manuscript already written, guess what? I encourage you to go to a community publisher and say, listen, I already have a manuscript. Can I sign on to the program? And can I work with your editors, right? So I highly, highly discourage you from self-publishing. That was the number one lesson I think I took from all the classes that I took.
That's a really good tip for people, and to kind of know that they can use the help of like an editor who's kind of like trained and knows what they're doing to kind of help you have it come together.
And you work with like 7-8 editors. Like that's also the thing that you learn during the book writing process. You work with many editors on many phases of the book, right? And it's mind-boggling how much work goes into a book and how many editors are involved. But the more eyes that are on it, obviously it gets better and better and better, right? And it makes sure that the final book you do put out in market is the best representation of you as an author in the market.
Well, you mentioned the layout, and I have to say I loved that it had like the pictures of the people's faces, like the different people who you profile. I thought that was a really fun touch to kind of like.
Well, I'm a visual person, and I wanted the stories to come alive. And I was inspired. I love the Wall Street Journal, how they do those black and white kind of not caricatures, but the black and white kind of drawings of the various CEOs they feature. So that was my inspiration, was the Wall Street Journal and having those there. But yeah, it gives you life, I think, and you go into the piece with that vision of that person, right? And through your imagination, and as you're reading about their story, right, you have the picture at front and center.
So we've talked kind of a little bit about how important bringing people together was for the people who you've profiled in this book. And throughout the book, you reference the proverbial oak tree. So what is the proverbial oak tree in the context of renewables, and kind of what made you decide to include this in the book?
Yeah, no, it's so funny. So I was going back and forth because I don't want to age myself. I'm 45, right? So I grew up in the 80s, and we used to have a saying, "Let's meet at the oak tree," and the context was that the oak tree was basically symbolic for a meeting place, right? Where where people with similar ideas or similar passions come to meet, right? So that's the proverbial oak tree analogy, right? I know that kind of probably got glossed on, and actually that was one of the exercises when I wrote the book. For example, one of the revisions was, Tom, okay, you want to use this proverbial oak tree analogy, you need to use it throughout the whole book. Go throughout the whole book and weave it in to the narrative, right? So that's an example of one of the revisions I had to take, one of the 31, right, was to weave in this analogy of this oak tree. But the oak tree for me and is important for symbolically for renewables, right? Because we as a renewables industry, and this is why community is so important, right? We as a community, we have to have those proverbial oak trees throughout our industry so that people can come together to plan, to strategize, to get to gain knowledge acquisition, right? And to get re-energized for our careers, right? And those oak trees come in many forms, right? They could be the trade associations. I'm a big fan of Sia and Abby Hopper and what she's been doing through programming there. That could be a proverbial oak tree where everybody in solar and storage, right, that's really interested in the industry can come together to facilitate knowledge transfer and to really strategize everything from policy to how to finance solar and storage, right? Another oak tree, for example, could be Sea Life, the Clean Energy Leadership Institute, where Esther Morales and her team for years now have created a platform where anyone who's really aspiring to be that next generation CEO of this industry can come together through a program, right, and get the necessary skill sets they need to advance in the industry, right, and help impact the future generations of this industry, of the future iterations of the industry. So those are just two of many examples, I would say, those proverbial oak trees that we have. Oak trees can also be inside companies, right? So we have synergy groups, for example, here at EDP Renewables, where I work. Those synergy groups help bring like-minded people together to figure out how do we make an impact in renewables, given our shared common backgrounds and our shared vision of what the future should look like. So those are the proverbial oak trees. And I try to weave that into the stories, right? What's fascinating was of the 25 to 35 CEOs that I mentioned in the book, they all were an oak tree to themselves because they all knew each other. They all were a community. They all helped each other. And you kind of figure that out when you read these stories. Subtly, you start to put the timelines together and go, whoa, these people were not like, hey, Scott Scar worked from 1970 to 1980, and then, Nancy Floyd did her stuff from 1980 to 1990. No, they were all working at the same time, and they're all interacting. They were funding each other's projects. They were working together on policies to put forward in front of congressmen and senators, right? They're all working together at the same time. And that's what really, I think, aids in this. Again, one of the key messages coming out of this book is the importance of community and the importance for us to foster these oak trees, right? These proverbial oak trees, the importance of us, even more so today, to create these centers, these meeting points where we can come together as an industry and inspire each other, challenge each other, right, to get to where we need to be as an industry. So that's the proverbial oak tree. I could have used another analogy. I mean, these days it's like, oh gosh, a meetup would be the most comparable thing if I had to use today's terminology, right? And not to date myself, but another thing I used in the book that someone laughed about was the word Rolodex. They're like, Tom, what is a Rolodex, right? And it's like, well, it's like your contacts in your phone book, in your iPhone, right? But and so I still do have a Rolodex as an example to point out to people. This is the way we used to, categorize business cards and by alphabet and the whole thing. But yeah, but that's the concept behind the proverbial oak tree and what I try to connote there.
I love that. I think that's a great takeaway for someone, whether they're working in the renewable industry or interested in getting into it or working in a different industry. I feel like that's something that we can all do is like find ways to work together with other people and find, even if people have different backgrounds, different situations, if you've got like the common mission or common like goals, you can find a way to like work together, learn from each other. And yeah, I think that's a great takeaway.
And we all can be mentors to each other. I mean, it doesn't have to be an age conversation, right? We all learn, we all have different experiences, we all come from different backgrounds. We can all be mentors to each other. And I think my biggest challenge that I want to leave with everybody here is pay it forward. Like I said before, we all had folks who helped us get to where we are in renewables. And we are, I feel like the more help you got, the more accountable you are to help the next generation of folks get into this industry, right? So pay it forward. We all have 15 minutes a week. That's all it takes is a quick 15-minute virtual coffee talk that could change someone's life, right? And get them introduced to this industry or get them excited about this industry. We all have 15 minutes. And if we all did our part, we would be even more stronger as an industry.
Nice. Well, so I'd love, Tom, for you to share where can people buy the book if they're interested or find out more about you, find out more about the book.
No, definitely. So I have, I think, my QR code here on my background, my nifty background. They can take a picture of and go to the website. Website's really easy. It's just wetooktherisk.com. I was shocked that it was available when I went to
Yeah, that's
buy
great.
the name, right? But you can go to the website. Obviously, the book is available everywhere: Amazon, Barnes and Noble, anywhere you go. But I highly do encourage you to go to your local bookstore. So I have my book on the national printing system. So what that means is you can go to any local bookstore, and even if my book is not on the shelf, you can go to the counter and say, "Listen, I want to buy a book. Can you ship it to the bookstore or ship it to my address?" It's we took the risk by Tom Weirich. They will find it and they'll ship it to you, or they'll deliver it to the bookstore. So I encourage you to go to your local bookstore. And I have like 6 or 7 deals across the country with local bookstores, but wherever you are, the book is available. And there is an audiobook that I did do, and I had to voice it. So if you want a good chuckle, definitely download that audiobook. It is available everywhere, Apple, Amazon, Audible, you name it. So if you are more of an Audible listener, the book is available as an audiobook too.
Awesome. Yeah, I noticed it's great to be able to support independent bookstores. I noticed that it was in like the Strand in New York City.
It's in the Strand. It's Shakespeare and Company. It's even the ferry boat building. In San Francisco, when you're waiting for a ferry boat, that local bookstore there has it. So it's in a couple of bookstores where I made the call and did exactly what I said. Had to pitch the book, the manager, the general manager of the bookstore, and get it out on the shelves there. But also Barnes and Noble has it, and like I mentioned, many other folks in all of the tier 1, tier 2 cities in the country.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Tom, for coming on and talking about the book. And yeah.
No, thanks for this opportunity. And listen, I'm available. My website, I do a blog. I have to get better at updating my blogs. I have to follow your leadership, Sophie, and being a little better at updating my mediums. But there's a blog there that I post. So I'm at different events. I donate the book to different groups. Like I did that for the Rise Solar Fellows, the Rise Wind Fellows. So if you are at one of these big conferences and you go to any of the Rise events, most likely I'm going to be there presenting the book. So it's a great opportunity to meet you in person or meet anybody, obviously, who's listening in person and talk more about the book.